Greetings and welcome back. In the previous mini lecture, I talked about how in Britain there was this battle that had been going on really for centuries between who was supreme. Was it the monarch? Was it the parliament? And I told you that the king and the aristocrats, later the parliament, were in kind of a political balance for centuries. And finally, with the Glorious Revolution, the Bill of Rights, Parliament prevailed. Parliament, or the legislature, was now the dominant institution of government. And for those of you who took me for American government, you may remember that I talked about this a little bit when I talked about political philosophy. I talked about how John Locke was an advocate for legislative supremacy. In that case, why the parliament should be supreme over the king. Remember, I talked about Thomas Hobbes, and he made the case for why the country would be better off with a strong executive or a strong king or queen for expediency. But with the Glorious Revolution, that debate is over. Parliament is now supreme. But Parliament was very elitist. We're really talking about political power for only the upper crust of British society, as I have written in the notes, until the 1800s, the 19th century. The nobility, the wealthy, and the Church of England dominated Parliament. And Parliament becomes democratized very slowly, very gradually. The Reform Acts granted more power to the people, and this allowed the prime minister to become really the dominant executive, assuming responsibility for party management and the day-to-day operation of government. Once again, I would ask you to consider the impact of this on the American political system. If you look at Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 1 deals with the Congress. Our founding fathers intended and they believed that just as the legislature, the parliament, was the dominant political institution in Britain, that so too should the legislature, in this case the Congress, be the leading branch of government for the United States, with the president primarily a check and a balance on the actions of the Congress. So another reminder of how the British historical experience impacted not only British political development, but that it certainly had an influence on American government as well. So Ruskin describes and discusses how political parties began forming in the 18th century. In fact, political parties really began as either opposition or supporters of Charles II. Remember, I talked about him after the Glorious Revolution. Throughout the 1800s, a two-party system developed, with the Whigs becoming the Liberal Party, and they kind of got eclipsed, if you will, by the Labour Party around 1900. And the Tories became the Conservative Party, and in fact, one of the nicknames even today in 2021 for the Conservative Party in Britain are the Tories. Ruskin points out that the French and American revolutions raised awareness and some pressure to expanding the electorate, but both major parties delayed this for a few decades. Now, I have a slight disagreement with Ruskin here, because certainly when you think about the American Revolution, the percentage of people who were really eligible to vote, really until the 1820s in the United States, were very, very limited. Keep in mind that only the House of Representatives was originally directly elected by the voters at all. The U.S. Senate was elected by state legislatures. The president was elected by this electoral college, and Supreme Court and federal judges were nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. And even with the House, maybe 5% of the electorate could vote. So here is another parallel between Britain and the United States. In both Britain and in the United States, more and more people were gradually extended the right to vote. We call that the expansion of suffrage. But until the 1820s in both Britain and in the United States, we have only a very thin band of men with property eligible to participate politically. And so I'm going to go through the Reform Acts in Britain, and I'm going to make some parallels to the United States because it is remarkable how the two countries basically go hand in hand in terms of expanding the electorate. So under the heading the Reform Acts, I have the Reform Act of 1832. Some call this the first Reform Act. I've added to Roskin here, the Industrial Revolution shifted economic power from landowners to men of commerce and industry. People were beginning for the first time in large numbers to move to these newly emerging cities. And this social transformation was confirmed politically by the 1832 Reform Act. So the act gave new urban manufacturing centers such as Manchester and Leeds more representation. Cities were represented for the first time, but they were substantially underrepresented. The rural areas still had a lot more power than the cities. The rural areas were vastly overrepresented, but the 1832 Reform Act did approximately double the electorate from about 3% to 7%. Roskin does point out that the act represented a shift in a perception of the Commons as a representative legislature, a legislature that should not just represent what Roskin calls the notables. I would call them the elites. But the Commons should be representative to the broad mass of citizens. Now, where is the U.S. parallel? The U.S. parallel is if you take a look in 1824, that was the first time that the people voted directly in a presidential election. And of course, the electors were then selected from the popular vote just as they are today. In fact, many people say that the first kind of modern mass-based People's Party were the Jacksonian Democrats in the 1828 election when Jackson defeated John Quincy Adams, who had defeated him in a very, very controversial election in 1824. So just as we get the first Reform Act in Britain in the early 1830s, we really see kind of a first opening up a bit of the electorate at the presidential level in the late 1820s. Roskin then talks about the Second Reform Act. The other name for this that Roskin doesn't mention is the Representation of Peoples Act in 1867. The electorate in Britain once again was more than doubled from 7% to 16%. I might star that one. This is really seen as the first real attempt to involve the cities, even though they were still underrepresented. A lot more urban dwellers now get the right to vote. And certainly, if you take a look at the U.S. Constitution, we have a very prominent Reform Act in the 1860s ourselves. The 15th Amendment, right, granting black men the right to vote, was introduced in the late 1860s, and the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. So once again, just as there is a notable Reform Act in Britain during this period of time, we see a notable Reform Act in the United States, although in the United States, the 15th Amendment was subverted by Jim Crow and by a whole variety of other laws that discriminated and prevented black men from voting. The Third Reform Act in Britain, once again, nearly doubles the size of the electorate from 16% to over 30%. Something that Roskin ignores, but I would add to that discussion, is that a modern innovation comes to Britain in the 1870s called the secret ballot, so that your vote is not known to everyone when you cast it. And I would argue that this Third Reform Act is very significant in Britain because only about a decade and a half after the passage of the Third Reform Act do we see a new party, the Labor Party, which is one of the two major parties today. With the Third Reform Act, there is now a large enough working class, a trade union movement, and what many would call democratic socialism. Certainly not Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, but more of a trade union consciousness developing in Great Britain. The Fourth Reform Act is often called the Representation of the People's Act of 1918. This gave near universal male suffrage to those over 21, and notice, to women over 30. And if you're wondering what's going on there, the idea of British men was, well, we'll give the right to vote to women, but to older women, women who are married and thus more conservative than single women. And in their mind, this is foolishness to me, having been married for over 35 years myself. These men somehow believed that they could influence their wives to vote the way that they wanted. It took another decade until 1928 for the voting age for women in Britain to be lowered to 21, as it was for men. Now notice, women get the right to vote in Britain in 1918, and in 1920 in America, we get the passage of the 19th Amendment that granted women the right to vote nationwide. Now, before then, voting was a matter for the states. Many states allowed women the right to vote before the passage of the 19th Amendment. For example, Wyoming, when it achieved statehood, was the first state to allow women the right to vote. Every western state except for New Mexico granted women the right to vote before the passage of the 19th Amendment. But the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote nationwide. Now, the last Reform Act in Britain lowered the voting age for both men and women to age 18 in 1969. And in America, we have a close parallel. The 26th Amendment granted 18-year-olds the right to vote in the United States, although some states did that beforehand. Notice how democracy was expanded in a very slow and gradual way that I would call evolutionary democracy. We also see a significant shift in the power distribution between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. You should star the Parliament Act of 1911, which resulted in the Lords no longer being able to reject or veto money bills and only delay regular legislation. The Lords could only delay legislation for 2 years, and that was modified to 1 year with the Parliament Act of 1949. Interestingly, a little-known portion of the law reduced the term of the House of Commons from 7 years, which had it had been since 1716, to 5 years, which it still is today. The reason for the Parliament Act of 1911 was they'd opposed the People's Budget of 1909, but passed it after an election of 1910, where the budget was the primary issue. I will have a mini lecture, a really short mini lecture on the rise of the welfare state to conclude this historical section.